Thank you very much, and good morning. It's always a pleasure to be back in the old sod, I have to say, after nearly 20 years in Copenhagen and 35 years since leaving County Down in 1981. Yeah. What I would like to do is I would like to talk about the future by looking at history. And I'm going to do that in a way which is reflecting how it is we understand the precautionary principle, one of the 4 environmental principles of the European Union Treaty, and its application in the context of environment, health, and well-being issues. Before doing that, though, and I'm going to rove a little bit, I hope I can, I just want to explain briefly the European Environment Agency. We are based in Copenhagen, which is in Denmark, not in Holland, as my mother still says. It's established by an EEC regulation, which means that we're required to do some things. Our job is really to produce information, and to do that by building bridges between science and policy. In doing that for 22 years now, we've moved much more from what you might call a thematic focus towards stuff, we still do a lot of it, towards a more systemic focus. And I heard Stephanie talk about systemic risks and systemic solutions, and we're in that game as well. We have this strong network called IONET. We also have a network of directors of EPAs across Europe, of which Laura is a member, of course. And our network comprises 33 member countries and 6 cooperating countries in the West Balkans. We also work with the Middle East and North Africa, and the countries that were formerly in the Soviet Union and are not in the European Union, such as Ukraine and Georgia, to build capacities around environmental information. We have 200 people to do that, so if you do the maths, we have about 5 people per country, which, given there's 500 million people in Europe, is kind of interesting proportionality, and a budget of about 45 million euros. So what do we do? We're there really to support policy, and in doing so, we see 3 timelines to support: 2020, 2030, and 2050. And as this slide shows, we have a lot of policies in Europe on the environment, 300 plus directives and other types of instruments. And so we spend quite a lot of our time understanding where we've come from in those. I would say probably too much time understanding the past, and also where we're going on that. Then we have these emerging frameworks in Europe, which are more with a 2030 perspective, and they're epitomized by the recent Paris Agreement, by the idea of establishing an energy union in Europe, by the recently agreed Sustainable Development Goals, which were mentioned by previous speakers, and so on. And we have a long-term vision for the environment in Europe, and it goes like this, and I'm not going to read it out, but I think it's a rather interesting perspective to which we aim towards trying to develop our knowledge and inform on how it is we go from a past of developing the environment in Europe for the last 40 years to how it is we would like Europe to be and how we would like to be in the coming 40 years. And this talks about circular economy, it talks about maintaining biodiversity and ecosystems, it talks about low carbon growth, but it does talk about us in terms of living in a globally safe and sustainable society. So when we come to our job, which is essentially to try and take a lot of information which has been gathered across all of these countries over 40 years in a very organic policy and development and knowledge development, we want to try and put it into some context and some sense so that people can understand that. And we do this by following the 7th Environmental Action Programme. And last year we produced our latest 5-year report. We call it the European Environment State and Outlook 2015. And in it we looked at trying to put our information in the context of the 3 priority objectives, which are essentially to preserve natural capital, to arrive at a resource-efficient low-carbon economy, and to safeguard health. And there's 2 overall patterns emerged from what is we call our piano table. And this table shows you in 3 columns and 2 rows. First of all, in the columns, the key overall trends with respect to natural capital, resource efficiency, and safeguarding risk to health. And then with respect to the first row looking in the past, and the second row looking in the future. Where you see green, it's positive. Where you see yellow, it's mixed. And where you see red, it imbalances negative. And essentially what we're able to say is that we have been, in Europe, much better at being able to achieve resource efficiency improvements than either sustaining the resilience of ecosystems or the resilience of ourselves in terms of our overall well-being. And the question you may ask is, why is that? And there's many answers to it, but I'll give 2 perspectives that would summarize it. The first one is that achieving efficiency improvements have been rather straightforward because we have technologies to be able to deal with the problem, what we call the end-of-pipe solution. And so that's why you see this primarily green perspective in the middle. The second issue is that ecosystems and people are complex. And I think this complexity and how it is we manage that complexity through policy actions and through various other approaches is not easy. And I would say that if you look back at the European environmental policy developments, we've evolved from a rather simple approach to a more complex approach, but it's just simply difficult. And there's another dimension here, which is the global perspective. We are influenced in Europe now much greater by global developments than we have been in the past. And if you take it for the health and well-being dimension, we have global systems of supply chains, which mean we have a very different food consumption perspective than we had 20 years ago, and it has several relations to our health and well-being. So it's a very simplified way of trying to boil down a lot of information. In the report, we talk about how do we respond to these trends. And the answer is, well, incremental efficiency gains are not going to be sufficient in the future to be able to achieve what it is we want to achieve, sustainability. What we need to be looking at is fundamental transitions in key systems of production and consumption. And they are namely food, which is rather underplayed in the overall discussion. Energy, we know a lot about. Mobility, we don't talk transport, we talk mobility, access to services, access to goods, access to what we want. The urban systems mentioned in previous presentations. But then two systems which are not directly contributing to environmental pressures, but which are arguably as important, if not more important, the finance system, how it directs us towards either a low-carbon economy or a not low-carbon economy, and the fiscal system, how we use taxes and subsidies to be able to arrive on a path towards sustainability. And a lot of our subsidy systems are in the opposite direction of sustainability. So we do that by talking about practices, changing our practices in governance, changing our practices in knowledge, and also encouraging innovations. So that's where we want to be to, but what does history tell us? We have two reports, and I hope there was delivered copies of the second one, because if it has been, it's the biggest report ever produced in the agency, and because of things like online and stuff like that, it will be always the biggest report produced by the agency. So if you get a hold of it, in 40 years' time, you could be holding on to something which is really famous, or not. There you go. 750 pages of something. So what we've been doing in the agency through a very inspired colleague called David G., who comes from England, and who retired, unfortunately, in 2012. And if you have a future conference around this sort of thing, invite him. He is so knowledgeable and so inspiring. I think Mike can probably confirm that. He's the author of these two reports, which involve bringing together a lot of people from around the world to help us understand how it is innovations in the past have contributed to developments, and how the use of the precautionary principle has either helped or not in regard to managing impacts on ecosystems and people's well-being. And so in the Treaty of the European Union, we have 4 environmental principles which are there to essentially guide the development of environmental policy. The first one is the precautionary principle, and the others are about preventive action, the polluter pays, and the rectification of damage at source. And I would say that with respect to the preventive, the polluter pays, and the rectification of environmental damage at source, we have a rather uncontroversial debate in society about it. The precautionary principle is very different. Although we have the precautionary principle in the treaty, there isn't really a kind of clear definition of it, and so in the work that we've been doing, we've come with a definition for ourselves. And essentially, what we're saying is that we use the precautionary principle to justify policy action in situations of high uncertainty, even ignorance, and certainly complexity, where we may need to act to avoid or reduce potentially serious or irreversible threats to health of ourselves or the environment and ecosystems, using an appropriate strength of evidence, taking into account the likely pros and cons of action and inaction. It's a little long, but it's rather rich in its kind of description and what it means. And essentially what we've done with these two reports is to come and look at the precautionary principle and its potential two roles as a trigger for debates on future innovation pathways in a resource-constrained world, where by 2050 we expect to have 10 billion people on the planet and probably a likely unprecedented climate change by then. And as a legal and moral justification for more timely actions on early warnings from science about potential hazards to ourselves and to ecosystems. So what do the two reports do? Well, first of all, one was published in 2001, the second one was published in 2013. You may think that's quite a long time between two reports, but actually the nature of the information in the reports is rather timeless. So we don't have to concern ourselves so much about annuality or being on time, so to speak. In this case, we can say that the information that we have in there, we could come and read it in 15 years' time and still draw a lot of inspiration from it. And what those reports do across the two volumes is to look at 34 case studies and ask the question towards these different issues around environmental chemicals, ecosystems, some of the emerging technologies, pharmaceuticals, radiations, a wide range of case studies. We ask experts in the field to tell the story of the different case studies. What happened in case X when it came to early warnings from science about particular problems? What happened in terms of the response, either from business or from public policy, to those early warnings from science, and what was the result of the lag between the early warning from science and the action taken and the results seen. And so the reports go into this, and it would be great to have 3 days to explain what the reports say. But I would like to boil it down to 5 insights that are relevant to this discussion around health and well-being. The first one is that we have a lot of evidence in these reports, and the reports cover the period 1750 to the early 2000s, so it's quite a long history we're looking at. We've quite a lot of evidence that if the precautionary principle had been applied, and by inference it had not been applied, then on the basis of early warnings from science, we could have saved a lot of lives and ecosystems, as well as ensured that the costs of inaction to society were substantially lower, and business would also have been steered towards what you might call less harmful innovations. Now, that's a big overall conclusion across a lot of case studies. One of the reasons for that is that we do have this rather asymmetric reality when it comes to cost-benefit analysis. And essentially it is that we're much better at understanding the costs and much less so at understanding the benefits. That's a lot of words there to describe that point. But I think paying attention to how it is this methodology is used and applied in public policy, and it's used and applied a lot, and how it could be adapted to reflect a better balance between economic, social, and environmental interests is something that we've been looking at with other people. With some difficulty, we haven't arrived at an alternative to CBA, but it is an area well worth proper exploration, perhaps in the research field more than anywhere else. Insight number one. Insight number 2, the nature of risk and harm expands over time when we look at these case studies. So when you come to look at the examples here, then you'll see that in asbestos, which was first identified as a potential problem in 1898 by a factory inspector in the UK who saw evidence and reported her concerns about that evidence, you then arrived at an understanding in 1929 that asbestosis was the effect. But then by 1954, we had lung cancer understood, then we had mesothelioma, and then most recently around throat and other cancers. Now, there are other examples here, DES at the bottom. We have vaginal cancer understood in 1970s. In 1980s, we see much wider reproductive problems, and then we see a transfer from one part of the body to another part of the body when it comes to cancer, in this case, breast cancer. And this is interesting for us because in understanding the relationship between warnings from science and policy action, the understanding is to be more preventive, as Stephanie was saying, be more anticipatory towards effects which we don't know about, but where we can have some understanding perhaps in terms of our own physiology, that there's at least in public policy terms, a risk on the downside that we should be anticipating towards. So this is an interesting insight, I think, that comes out across many case studies. Insight number 3, to rethink environment and health research. A piece of work that was done by a professor in Denmark, Philippe Grandjean, was to get one of his students to look at all of the environment and health journal articles from the 20th century into the first decade of this century. And to do it by looking at what's called CAS numbers, which means you can get ready access to the descriptions of the articles. And what they found was that there was a huge bias towards investing in research in what we already know, as opposed to investing in research about things that we know something about and we know we should know more about, but we don't invest in proportionally. And one of the most interesting observations, I think, is that even in this first decade of this century, we were still seeing half of all of these articles in these journals talking about things that we know a lot about, and they're still important: mercury, lead, other heavy metals. Interesting insight. Probably questioning the scientific paradigm about replication and verification. Perhaps reflecting policymakers' desire for more certainty from science. We've observed it, I think. I have observed it where I work in the last 20 years. And I think it's been happening elsewhere. And we also know that if you're a professor, and I have to say this very carefully, you have a job for a long time, and it means that you can have quite a few cycles of studentships coming through where they're taught largely the same thing as the previous studentship, and therefore there may be a need for somewhat more innovation. And I make a huge exception to Michael DePledge, not because he's sitting at the table, but because we know each other for a long time, and he is very much an exception to that point. And then we argue for this more cross-disciplinary research, which we're seeing some examples of, systemic science community developing in Europe, but it's still a niche innovation compared with the prevailing research paradigm. Insight number 4. We got another colleague to do a research into the money that had been spent in EU research programs, framework program 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, now Horizon 2020, but not including that in this, and trying to understand in the period 1994 to 2013, what was the balance of research between the economic interests and the societal interests, if I could put it like that. And the answer is quite striking, I think, when you see that the investment in innovations, which we need, and research is part of that game, are 99% of the overall investment. And the investment in understanding the risk to our health and to the health of ecosystems is less than 1%. In our view, a balance of 90-10, 85-15 would be more in line with how it is we would see a public policy like research balancing those interests. Insight number 5 is the role of price in managing risks. And so what we observe across a lot of the case studies is that the external costs of harm are often paid by taxpayers and not by the source of the harm. And this often happens because the time lag between identifying that there is a product which is harmful, the impacts that product has on a wide population through the consumption use of that product, and the action that's taken to do something about it, which may result in compensation costs and other types of actions. It's often decades and several decades in terms of the time lag, and the company's often gone. So the ability to obtain from the source of the harm compensation for the public health costs and other costs is not there, and so it falls to the taxpayer. We could, though, think that through the fiscal system that we're much more explicit on what it is we want to do when it comes to using taxation for the purposes of dealing with harmful products. And to do this in a way which is perhaps going back to the previous insight on harm expands over time, to think that the tax expands over time, to recognize that there's a relationship between how it is we want the source of innovation to pay for any kind of costs over time. And then you come to the issue of, well, what do we do with the newer technologies, the nano, the GMOs, the mobile phones, where we've observed already that there's some evidence to do with a relationship between overuse of that phone towards this part of your head and brain cancer. And the idea of thinking that maybe we should be considering putting down upfront liability bonds, not of a large proportion towards the company, in terms of its revenues and its profits, but to build a kind of safety net for any kind of possible harm that results decades down the line now. In the event that it doesn't happen, we can give the money back to the company. In the event that the company doesn't exist anymore, we can use it for some common purpose, common good. So there's some insights from our report, and the link to the long-term transition agenda that I was discussing is that we have to think a little bit about innovations. We often have this feeling that innovations are a good thing, a win-win situation. Huh? If you take the circular economy discussion in Europe, there's a kind of sense in the policy-making community that circular economy can do no wrong. But we've observed already that if you recycle cardboard and you through the technologies that you use and through the component elements that are in that cardboard, then you arrive at a thing called a pizza box, which a lot of us can recognize, and you put your pizza in it, and you realize that actually there's contamination between that box and that pizza, recycled cardboard. So what happened in Denmark is that very recently they banned recycled cardboard for pizza boxes because of the food contact issue, and they've insisted upon non-toxic cardboard, which is a very strange expression if you think about it. Why should we have to say non-toxic cardboard? It should be non-toxic. But the recycling technologies are inadvertently arriving at toxic outcomes in the recycled material. And this is important to understand because circular economy is not always a win-win situation. We have to think about where some of the potential problems may come. So, looking ahead, and this is interesting because 3 years ago, no it doesn't, nearly 3 years ago, we had a workshop. We have a scientific committee in the agency full of like august, often men, although we've had some women over time. It's been really good that the chair of the scientific committee who's just finished her 8-year term was a woman. Of course she was, I said she. But we have a lot of men in the scientific committee. Anyway, we said in early 2014, let's have a discussion about environment, health, and well-being and understand from a science perspective what it is we want to look at. And it's one of these wonderful things where you invite a lot of people together and you don't really understand who everybody is or what they're about or what their motivation is. But somebody came from DG Research and they heard somebody talk about human biomonitoring, which is not a new issue because it's been around for a while. But he went, I think we should invest in this. Now that's 2014, February, I think, so we're nearly 3 years since then. And the answer is human biomonitoring for the EU, which is an exercise to try and look at establishing a human biomonitoring network that would be fully established, because currently we have experiments, we don't have the established approach yet. An investment of 70 million euros over 5 years from the beginning of next year to the end of 2021, involving many more countries, if I'm honest, than we would wish, because it makes for a project management challenge, I should say. But it includes 22 EU member states, including Ireland. And I asked Catherine, my colleague who's running it in the agency, who's the Irish player? And it's the Health Service Executive. And it's Maurice Mulcahy, who's sitting on the second row here, involved in the consortium. So it's great to learn that sort of stuff just on your way to from Copenhagen to Dublin. Israel is in the consortium as well. Ask the question, why? I don't know. But it's really interesting if we could, in the 5 years, establish a rather targeted, because I think it will have to be targeted, and a highly relevant kind of approach to this networking, we could see a lot of investments into this. And imagine what it may mean for changing the paradigm of monitoring, because our monitoring is about monitoring the environment and the media. If we change to monitoring ourselves, we may actually see a rather fundamental difference in monitoring in the coming 10, 20 years. HBM for EU. Horizon 2020 can do good things, and Laura's on the advisory group that is trying, amongst others, on this. My last slide. If you want to come and look at a transition in Europe towards a low-carbon, resource-efficient economy within which we respect natural capital and the ecosystem services that natural capital delivers for our health and well-being, as well as for our economy, then we want to be able to understand this relationship to us, both in terms of our health, but also this much wider aspect called well-being. And we tend to use the term without maybe thinking. I certainly don't have all the elements in my mind. But in the agency, we have a history of producing environment and health reports. We did it in 2000, 2005, 2013. And now we would like in 2018 to produce environment, health, and well-being report. And the center story of it is the human condition. But we want to look at it from angles that are a little bit different, and certainly from what we've done in the past, and not all environmental. So this issue of demographic trends, healthy life years, chronic burden of disease, as Stephanie mentioned, the idea of urbanization and the benefits and costs that come from our approaches to that. We would like to understand regional environmental pressures regionally, because we feel that there may be a distributional element here which is worthy of a bit more consideration in terms of inequalities across the European region, and to link that to socioeconomic status and try and understand the relationship between the socioeconomic status and the environmental exposure. And then to try and answer the key question, how do these trends combined influence essentially our exposure, vulnerability, and resilience across Europe, 500 million people. Now, that's a hugely ambitious thing to do. And what we're going to try and do by 2018 is to put down markers about what such an assessment could look like, and what such an assessment could tell us about a possible 8th Environmental Action Programme, because the 7th Environmental Action Programme comes to an end in 2020, and in it, at the end of that programme, it says we should establish an 8th Environmental Action Programme from the 1st of January 2021. That was in 2014. The European Union is a very different place today from 2-3 years ago, so we're not sure. But if there is one coming, we would like to put environment, health, and well-being at the centre of such a programme. And therefore, I'm going to finish by asking, there's something wonderful about Ireland. Sorry, there are many things wonderful about Ireland, but there's something particularly wonderful about Ireland, and it's the way this poodle dog, this is my description of sits on its backside, which is my description of the map of Ireland, and how you have this really rich spatial system of understanding what's going on at levels which we can't even get close to. We will never get close to in this European level being able to understand some of these distributional issues. So I wanted to make a plea, and I'm doing it without having spoken to Laura or Stephanie or whatever, but I'm going to make the plea anyway. If you would be interested in being a case study in the middle of that report, which tried to get a bit more fundamentally at the local level, the real impact for people, because as I say, for us, it will be difficult. And I have looked at the EPA network. I haven't looked at HSE, but I look at these maps and I go like, if we had some ability and expertise to be able to put together, and I think Mike may say something about this in his presentation, it'd be really fantastic to put a case study down and say that this is what it's about. This is what we're really trying to tackle here. It's complex, it's multidimensional, it's multiple endpoints, but it's really worth considering how can policy respond to it. It'd be fantastic if we were able to do it, and I will stop there. Thank you.